different places. Okay. Um, of course, this was sent out through B'nai Israel Reform Temple in Oakdale, where I was the rabbi for, I may say, almost 5 decades. And also the congregation in Delray Beach, Temple Sinai, where I am an interim rabbi for a year or two. And also I see some other people like David who came on, which is very nice too. And it's very nice that B'nai Israel doesn't limit these kinds of programs to just temple members, understanding that education is important for everyone. So, as those of you who have been with me on other programs know, I always like to start off with a bracha, a blessing to center ourselves, and the bracha for study. And so for those of you who are able to, but we'll do it very slowly, those of you not familiar with the bracha, this prayer, to please join in with me, or just by listening. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Amen. So, over the last few years, when I've been down here in Florida and all, oh, hi, Susan, nice to see you, is that I've obviously tried to come up with various subjects, and I try to the best of my ability not to repeat up myself, although I have no doubt that as I'm getting older, there's going to be repetitions because I'm going to forget what I did before. But looking at most of you, I know that you won't remember either, so that's excellent. We're all set here. Oh, God. Anyway, except some people. Hi, Ronnie. Nice to see you. Why am I speaking about the subject of mitzvot, which you might say, what is that? It's been done already. We know what mitzvot are, and mitzvahs, to put it in the anglicized, the English version. What is this all about? And is this discussion and presentation by Moss really helpful to me? Well, it came about for the following reason and place in my life. And it comes about actually from my study of Kabbalah, of spirituality. As many of you know, I would have to certainly say that I'm a student of Kabbalah. And by the way, in the next class, which is December 21st, 2 weeks from tonight, same time, same station, it is going to be on the spiritual underpinning of mitzvot and why that is so very important. However, you might notice the way that I just phrased that, the spiritual underpinning foundation of mitzvot. So the question then becomes, what comes first, the spiritual aspect or the mitzvot? And let me explain to you what I mean. I do quite a few online Zoom classes, one particular with a teacher of mine of Kabbalah. Unfortunately, a couple of weeks ago when I was in Yerushalayim, I was actually able to be with him twice during the first week I was in Israel before my bike ride. I was able to meet with him face-to-face and not just through Zoom, Eliyahu Shir. And as Rabbi Shir has said to me many times, you cannot really study Kabbalah if you don't live a life of mitzvot. There are people, and certainly there are many people today who, as I was at one time in my life, very much into spiritual practices. So I did go to retreats, spiritual retreats, where I learned meditation, and I shared meditation programs with my temple family up north in Oakdale many times. And there is what's called the Jewish Renewal Movement, which is a modern movement in which spiritual techniques are very much taught. I remember quite a few years ago, I went to a program by a marvelous rabbi, I think he's passed away, David Cooper. And the program was learning meditative techniques. And so we sat for almost 20 minutes chanting the Shema to a drum beat. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu. And it was an extraordinary experience because, especially with your eyes closed and breathing in and out, and with this kind of a haunting melody and the drum beat again, and getting faster and faster and faster and louder. Actually, and this was for 20 minutes without stopping. And at the end of that, I had an extraordinary experience. I actually experienced going into a black hole. I actually felt I was being drawn into the infinite black hole of Hashem, of God, of the divine. It was an extraordinary spiritual experience. But the question becomes am I supposed to do just that? Well, if I was only going to be oriented in the spiritual aspect of that, I could do that every single day and feel close to God. However, the question becomes then when I get tired of doing that, or I get bored with doing that, or exhausted with doing that, then where do I go? What's my next turn on? What's my next exciting, meditative, spiritually turn on technique? However, if in addition to that, not necessarily in place of that, twice a day, when I wake up in the morning and pray, and when I go to sleep at night, I pray, or evening service for Mariv, I pray the Shema, and I add a spiritual technique to that, then I'm doing, according to the teachings that I now understand a little bit better than I did years ago, then I'm really doing the Jewish thing. Because halakha, or Jewish law, says, and the mitzvah is that we are required to say the Shema twice a day. Whatever meditative techniques we bring to it, a spiritual turning on we bring to it, I need to pray the Shema under this understanding of a mitzvah twice a day. So I've now begun to understand the importance of developing in a mitzvah life, of doing the as best as I can as a modern Jew and as a modern person, the different customs and mitzvot, or commandments, of Jewish life according to our tradition, but in a modern way, and then adding to that the spiritual element. What happens is, and as Rabbi Shir has pointed out and other teachers which I've either read about or listened to online, is that there are many people today who go to these retreats, go to spiritual stuff. I mean, let me put it this way. You could become an instant mystic, Jewish mystic. You could become a Kabbalist in one night by going online, putting in Google, I want to become a Kabbalist. I want to become a Madonna, okay? And you could become one in one night, okay? And you could walk away and saying, gosh, I could feel God in my life. But the problem with that, or the challenge, is that how do you keep that going if you don't have a mitzvah life? If you don't have the consistency that living a life centered in Jewish law and tradition as it's been handed down through the centuries, how do you then continue the other aspect? Eventually, it's going to be gone because the foundation is the spiritual underpinnings, which I'll talk about in more detail next time. So my question tonight is, and I put a lot of thought, I think, into tonight's presentation, and sharing with you a very difficult subject, and that is, what do mitzvot mean to a Reformed Jew? What can a life of mitzvot, as I've sort of just described it to you very briefly, what can this mean to a Reformed Jew? What does halakha, Jewish law, mean to a Reformed Jew? Do we have any mitzvot that we need to follow or should follow or have a feeling to follow? How do we do all of this? How do we put it together? So let me take a step backward and do some definition of terms. First of all, what does a mitzvah mean? The word mitzvah, or the plural is mitzvot. Well, it basically means a what? A commandment. Actually, I Googled it. What are the synonyms of a commandment? Decree, demand, charge, directive, They're all musts, M-U-S-T-S. What they aren't are suggestions. There's that old joke about the 10 Commandments, right? And when Moses came down from Mount Sinai, he didn't say, well, folks, I got 10 suggestions, okay? No, they are 10 mitzvot. As many of you, I'm sure, are aware, if not, I clue you in, there are many more than 10 mitzvot in Judaism. If obviously there wasn't the muting thing, I could ask who knows. There are what? 613 mitzvot. 613. 365 of them are in the negative. Those are the thou shalt and nots. Remember the word thou? Okay, or you shall not. For those of you who are too young to remember the word thou, okay, thou shalt not what? Murder. Thou shalt not commit adultery. All the thou shalts, nots. And 248 of them are in the positive. Thou shalt honor your father and mother. Thou shalt leave the four corners of your field unplowed and unharvested for the poor in the community, etc., etc. But there are 613 of them. So the question then becomes is, what does a Reformed Jew do with all of this? By the way, the majority of the 613 mitzvot cannot literally be done today by any Jew, whether it's Reformed, Conservative, Orthodox, Satma, Bobover, Chabad, it doesn't matter. The majority of them cannot be literally done today. And why? Because they're involved in the temple in Jerusalem, the performing of the different rituals and ceremonies that the Kohanim officiated at thousands of years ago. So the majority of them can't be done, although they can be done in one strange way. So for instance, in the traditional morning prayer service, there is a listing of the various offerings that are described in the third book of the Torah, the book of Leviticus, Vayikra, and they describe the various offerings that the Kohanim, the priests, offered every single day of the week, every morning, and also the various lightings of the incense and the prayers involved with that. According to tradition, because even though there's no temple in Jerusalem, we are fulfilling those mitzvot as long as we read them, even though we can't do them. Okay, so let me stop for a moment with my talking and show you the following video, which I found online. God bless Google, okay? There's no question. I do believe that computers and Google are divinely created because they allow us to learn more than ever before. So I simply Googled I went actually into YouTube and I Googled, what is a mitzvah? And I came up with this video. It's about 3 minutes long, and it kind of puts together some of the things I've said already, and then take me to the next part of my presentation. So I'm going to put it up here, and I'm hoping you guys can see that. Well, not yet. Okay. If you can see a blank screen in the middle of your screen, shake your heads yes. Okay. Here goes the video. Hopefully you can hear it.
In Judaism, it's not enough to just hold a belief.
Can you hear it?
What's important is what you do. It's an action-oriented religion, and the individual actions are called mitzvahs, or in Hebrew, mitzvot. One mitzvah, for instance, is observing the Sabbath. Another is keeping kosher. They mainly involve rituals, ethics, and relations between people and with God. While mitzvah is often translated as good deed, it literally translates as a commandment. You've probably heard of bar and bat mitzvahs. That just means son or daughter of the commandment. When children become adults in the Jewish tradition, they are now responsible for keeping the mitzvot. Many of the mitzvot are based on common sense ethics, like don't murder, while others don't seem to make sense, like the mitzvah not to combine wool and linen. And some are incredibly unique to Judaism, like the Passover Seder. The rabbis counted 613 mitzvot in the Torah called mitzvot deraita, from honoring parents to not taking revenge. And they created further rabbinic commandments, mitzvot derabanan, from lighting Shabbat candles to public Torah readings. Not even the holiest rollers can do every mitzvah. Some are obsolete, like stoning, while others are not actually possible, like anything involving the temple, which was destroyed 2,000 years ago. Still, mitzvot give people guidance for how to live in the world, and some Jews take that guidance extremely seriously. There is a huge spectrum of ways that people observe mitzvot. Some make their own decisions. Others follow a denominational position or ask a rabbi. With kosher, it's a mitzvah not to combine milk and meat. Some take that to mean no cheeseburgers, while others wait 6 hours between eating a burger and eating cheese. So why does anyone take on mitzvot? One answer is for the same reason kids follow their parents' rules. They trust the source, even if they don't necessarily understand all of the rules. There's a because I said so feeling that comes up sometimes in learning about mitzvot, particularly the ones that seem nonsensical. Another way to think of it is as a practice, like yoga or playing the piano. While you might not feel like practicing every day, over time, the commitment gets easier. And with discipline, you get stronger, faster, in the zone. The idea is that the practice of following the mitzvot makes you better at connecting to the holy. Committing isn't easy, but the more you commit, the more you get out of it. For instance, keeping Shabbat sets the day apart, and over time, creates a holy space every week. We are all obligated to someone or something. Kids, work responsibilities, taxes. Mitzvot are an obligation to something larger, community, and God. To learn about the origin of these Jewish laws, watch the next video in the Judaism 101 series and click to subscribe.
Judaism is pretty focused on what you do from day to day. Not just when and how to pray, but how to eat, raise kids, farm.
Okay, quiet. Okay, very good. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that. Everyone could see that, right, and hear it? I hope. Okay, very good. All right, so that was a cute summary. I love the photographs. The kids are cute, right? They're gorgeous. Yeah. So what does then this mean for us? There are basically three ways to view a mitzvah life as I'm trying to describe it to you. One way is, and some of you have heard me talk about this over the years. One way is what is, and I wish I had a chalkboard. One way is called theonomy. The prefix nomi means law, theo means God. So this is God-centered law. In other words, this would be basically the way that an Orthodox or traditional Jew observes and looks at the mitzvot, all 613. Whether he or she can follow them all or not is totally irrelevant. And so in theonomy, God said, you shall do all of these things. And if you don't do them, guess what? You're committing a sin. Very simple, okay? There's no in between in Orthodox Judaism. These are the laws, they are theonomy. If God said it, theo, this is the law, the mitzvot, then you have to do it. And if you don't, you're committing a sin and have to deal with that in that way. What is the opposite? The opposite would be what's called autonomy, or auto, meaning obviously self-law. In other words, God didn't say this. You can't prove it to me. So guess what? I make my own laws. I can do anything I want, anytime I want. That's why? Because I'm an autonomous human being. Actually, Reform Judaism, during its early period, the development in the 1800s, came from an autonomous place. Very much actually coming from the century before that, the 1700s, and the 1600s, the Age of Enlightenment. When people began to, because before that, the law was what? God-centered. And particularly in the Christian world, of which the Jews lived in, obviously, God said it, and that was it. And this, of course, I don't know how many of you watch programs like The Crown, where now Judy and I are watching The Empress, okay? And that's all about the emperor and empress of the Austrian-Hungary Empire during the 1800s, I think it is. And it is, the belief was that there is theonomy, and I can transfer the theonomy to the king or the royalty or the pope, and therefore their law is the law and cannot be violated. If it is, you'll be punished because you're committing what? Your transgression or a sin. And so in the 1700s, and also actually in the 1600s with the Protestant Reformation and Martin Luther, is that the church and the kingship and royalty began to what? Be questioned. And so you had the French Revolution, you had the American Revolution, you had Reform Judaism developing in the 1800s, which said, guess what? The law is not theonomic, God-centered, it is human-centered. Human beings created the law. Human beings created these mitzvot. And therefore, just as human beings created it, we can overturn it. We can determine for ourselves the kind of Jewish life, in this terms of speaking of Judaism and not other aspects of all of this. We can now do it our way. After all, if Descartes, I think Descartes was what, the 1600s? If Descartes could say, I think, therefore I am, just because I have a mind, I can therefore determine my own future. That's autonomy. The problem is, where do we lie as Reform Jews? Early Reform Judaism was autonomous. During the 1700s, the 1800s, as Reform Judaism began to develop in Europe, they began to question everything. And simply to be able to say, you know something, I can question the law, any custom. And so they simply said, well, take for instance, the custom of wearing a kippah, of wearing a yarmulke for a male. There is no place in the Torah that says a man must wear a head covering. There is no place even in the rabbinic literature, such as the Talmud, that a man should wear a head covering. So guess what? It's only custom. God didn't tell us to wear a head covering. I can take it off. This continued, as some of you know, looking around the faces here. Hi, Marilyn, Claire, and Bruce. Looking around the faces here, some of you are old enough to remember Reform Judaism even here in America, certainly even through the 1990s in some cases. If you were to walk into Temple Emmanuel on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan in the 1980s, even the early 1990s, and wearing a yarmulke, a kippah, as you walked in, there would be an usher and would tell you, take it off, or you cannot enter into this temple. That's sort of like autonomy, but now defined by the congregation saying, you know something, that's not really Jewish anyway. There's no law, so you don't have to follow it. We don't want you to follow it. That's what we determine, because every congregation is also autonomous. And so there was actually in the 1800s in Europe, I guess I'd use the word agency or organization that developed in German. I remember this, so I'm going to impress all of you maybe, called the Wissenschaften des Judentums, which means the scientific study of Judaism. And these were great genius scholars, rabbinic scholars, who went through all of the customs and laws of Judaism to determine which of them made rational sense, because if we're an autonomous, free human being, then how do we determine how we're going to live? With our mind. And if my mind says, boy, this doesn't make any sense, this is irrational, this is superstitious, this is silly, then I won't do it. Because maybe, who knows, maybe there is no God. Because I can even question what? God's existence, which also occurred at these similar periods of time. And so to give an example of all of this, take one of the basic customs of Judaism, which happens to be what? One of the 613 mitzvot, and that is to circumcise a male child on the 8th day. It is midoraita, from the Torah itself. It is not midorabanan, as that little video talked about. I'm going to go back to that in a little bit. It wasn't from the rabbinic period. It was in the Torah itself. It is one of the most basic of all the Jewish, I was going to say customs, but it's not a custom. It is a mitzvah. It is a halacha. It is a Jewish law. So the Wissenschaften des Judentums began to study this and say, where did this thing come about? What is it all about? And they also began to say, well, you know something? If we're autonomous people and we can question all of these things because we do have a mind, what about maybe it's not even healthy? Maybe it's not even sanitary. Maybe it's none of the things that we thought. What is the purpose of it? Interestingly enough, the rabbinic organization, the professional organization, which I'm a member of, and all Reform rabbis in America are members of, is the Central Conference of American Rabbis. In one of the earliest discussions of this rabbinic organization, going back to what, the 1800s in America, okay, they actually sat around and said, you know something, maybe we should do away with, as a Reformed Jewish movement, maybe we should do away with circumcising our baby boys on the 8th day, because it is only what? A custom or a superstition. It's barbaric. It is primitive. Why should we even do this? And maybe there's even no health reason for doing it as well. This goes back to, I believe it was the late 1800s here in America. Interestingly enough, they thought about it and they discussed it. And this can be found in the early journals of the Central Conference of American Rabbis. And guess what they determined? They said, you know something, we can't do away with it. And the reason is because it is such an integral part of being Jewish. We have to keep it. Even though we don't really believe in it at all, it's a barbaric custom, but we got to keep it anyway. What's very interesting, if you remember that video, it talked about two different kinds of mitzvot. One is the mitzvah that comes described in the Torah, literally in the Torah. So obviously the Torah does say, when God said to Abraham, you will circumcise your son Isaac on the 8th day. It says it very specifically, and it says, and you shall do this for all the generations to come as a covenant of a symbol of the relationship between you, the people of Israel, and between me and God. So it's very, very specific and definitely stated. That's a Torah law. However, there are some laws that are not in the Torah, which are called Midrabanan from the rabbinic period, which was thousands of years later. And notice they all come together as the 613. However, even the rabbis during the Talmudic period put a greater stress on Torah law, which was closer to the source, that is, that moment of giving the law at Mount Sinai from God to the Jewish people through Moses, and the laws that were created later on based upon the Torah. So to give an example, in the Torah, it says what? In terms of the Sabbath, it says very specifically, I'll use the thou shalt not light any fires in your home on the Sabbath. Therefore, to light a fire on the Sabbath, it is forbidden. That's Torah law, very specifically. But the rabbis later on said that doesn't make sense. It creates a really big problem. Why? Because guess what? How do you cook on Shabbat? And by the way, for those of you who grew up Orthodox, or I was just in Israel, on Shabbat, you can't go into a hotel that keeps kosher, and all of them do, and have a hot meal on Shabbat. It's almost always a cold meal, unless the following. There is a way, according to the Rabbanan, to the rabbis, how you can get around that, to create a hot meal, especially during the winter. How do you keep a light on to study Torah? How do you keep something on to stay warm during the winter? Okay, so what did they say? You can light a fire before the Sabbath begins and keep it burning throughout the Sabbath. What you can't do is to start a fire on the Sabbath. So they took the Torah law and kind of interpreted it for the times that they lived in. Notice now what begins to happen, even in traditional Judaism, but as I'm going to point out in a few moments, all the more so for us in Reform Judaism. This is called heteronomy, like heterosexual, meaning both. In other words, theonomy, the law from God, but also autonomy. You know something? I can take the laws that were given by God and be able to make them a part of my life and to make them important from me. Let's take, for instance, the whole concept and the whole law of kashrut, of keeping kosher. There are three main aspects of keeping kosher. One is certain animals and fish and seafood that you can eat, and some that you can't eat. The Torah is very specific. This is a Torah law. It says in the book of Exodus, very specifically, if an animal chews cud, in other words, it has two stomachs, and then eats, and then, pardon this groat thing, swallows it and it chews it again, and then swallows it and digests it, and has cloven hoofs, you can eat that animal. So obviously, one thing you can't eat is what? A pig. Okay. And the same thing, of course, it talks about you're not supposed to eat seafood, like lobsters, etc. And it goes through all the description of those things you can eat and those things you can't eat. There's no question. In the Torah law, there's no ifs, ands, or buts. To give a cute example of this, a number of years ago in Israel, there were some biologists who were actually able to create a pig that had two stomachs. So they went to the chief rabbi of Israel and said, we've created a kosher pig. It has two stomachs because it chews now its own cud, and the pig does have cloven hoofs. So can we call the pig now kosher, this pig? And they said, sorry, once a pig, always a pig. That's the end of the discussion. Okay, so that's the way it goes. However, the Torah is very specific. However, there's two other aspects of keeping kosher. One is only to buy meat where the animal was kosher killed. I'm assuming most of you are familiar with that on some level. Interestingly enough, it does not say anywhere in the Torah, you shall not slaughter an animal by kosher methodology. It does not say that in the Torah anywhere. That is midrabanan, from the rabbis later on. The other thing about mixing milk and meat, nowhere in the Torah does it say thou shalt not mix milk and meat. Nowhere. There is a verse about taking a kid, a baby goat, while it's nursing from its mother, but it doesn't, and because it talks about meat and milk in the same verse, they use this to say, well, thou shalt not have a cheeseburger. But actually nowhere in the Torah does it say, thou shalt not eat a cheeseburger. Nowhere. This was created later on by the rabbis. So let us take this aspect of kashrut for a moment, because it's a very good one for me to use. So now you know that there are laws pertaining to kosher that are in the Torah, and then there were aspects of keeping kosher that were added later on. Well, guess what? If you are Orthodox or a traditional Jew, you cannot distinguish between the laws of the Torah and the laws of the rabbis. They're all given according to Orthodox Judaism. All of them are theonomic. All of them came from God, whether from Mount Sinai through Moses in the Torah, as described, written there, or later on in the discussions of the rabbis were inspired by God, theonomy, God's law. However, what about if we are now an autonomous modern Jew, such as we are, how many are the 19 of us here now, that we are autonomous modern Reformed Jews, and we want to somehow figure something out about kosher. You know, I've heard a lot about it. I've read articles, I've done some studying. You know something? I did read about how there were some Jews, especially during the Middle Ages, or even during Nazi Germany, that chose to die, to be executed rather than eat pork or violating the laws of kashrut. So if there were Jews who were willing to die rather than violate these laws of kosher, you know something? Maybe that could mean something to me, but what does that mean as a modern Jew? What does it fit into me? So remember the concept of heteronomy. I say, you know something, this does something to do with God and the people of Israel and Jewish history. There's some power behind it. I feel it inside of me, but I'm autonomous. I can make up my own decisions. And it's not simply, well, I'm going to go and have a lobster dinner tonight because I like to eat lobster. Maybe I'll shrimp tonight. Something I really love, a BLT. Okay. I really love, I don't know about you guys, but I'm riding my bike outside and I go certain places. Going back to Long Island, there's a wonderful place on Church Avenue, and I forget what it is now. Okay, there's a deli, and you go by there in the morning, and they're putting bacon on the grill, and it comes out through the windows. Oh my God, it smells so good, right? Okay, maybe I just like the smell of bacon. Okay, however, as a heteronomic modern Reformed Jew, maybe I ought to say, if I'm going to eat bacon or do any of this story, lobster, maybe I first got to go through a process and say, something, what could it mean to me? Let me give you a perfect example of this with a teacher of mine from rabbinic school, Rabbi Eugene Borowitz. Unfortunately, he should rest in peace, passed away. He was one of the greatest theologians of modern Reformed Judaism. If you never read any of his books, you should. Eugene Borowitz, Borowitz. And he was very much of a proponent. Actually, he developed this along with Abraham Heschel, another great rabbi who was a conservative theologian, conservative Judaism, called covenantal relationship with God. And both he and Heschel said, something, God speaks to each one of us as Jews, a member of the tribe of the people, but as individuals. And therefore it is up to me, just as God spoke to Abraham, spoke to Isaac, spoke to Jacob, spoke to Moses. God is speaking to me, and I have to make a covenant with God, a pact with God, a relationship with God, and say, something, God, you mean this to me, but what do I mean to you? So Rabbi Borowitz told a great story about keeping kosher in a Reform, heteronomic, as I'm describing it, way. By the way, does everyone understand more or less what I'm saying so far? Everyone following more or less? Okay, blink your eyes 3 times. Okay, so he tells the interesting adventure of his. This is quite a few years ago. Rabbi Borowitz happened to be out west somewhere, probably in Texas or somewhere, and he was asked to speak at some temple out in Texas somewhere. So he was by himself. He wasn't with his family, his wife, and he found himself in a restaurant. It was a non-regular restaurant, not a kosher restaurant. You'll see understandably why it wasn't kosher. It didn't matter to him, because he was a classical Reform Jew. And he was sitting in the restaurant and he's going through the menu, and he noticed on the menu bison, or what's known as buffalo, but there's no such thing as a buffalo, by the way. I hope all of you know that. There's a bison. There's no such thing as a buffalo. Anyway, not even Yellowstone, the bison, actually. Anyway, I learned that going to Yellowstone National Park. He noticed on the menu bison burgers, and he said, wow, I've never had a bison burger. And so he began to what? As a Reform heteronomic Jew, what he did was Rabbi Borowitz, Eugene Borowitz, he kept Torah kosher, not rabbinic kosher. So he would eat a cheeseburger. He wouldn't buy kosher meat in the kosher butcher, because whether the animal was slaughtered kosher-wise or not was not a part of his Jewish determination of his covenantal relationship with God. But Torah law was. And so we sat there trying to picture a bison. And does it have cloven hoofs? So he's trying to picture, and this was before cell phones, so he couldn't Google a picture of a bison, okay? Or check the criteria of bison. Does a bison have cloven hoofs? Maybe it does. Maybe it does. Does a bison chew its cud? So he's trying to picture a bison somehow like a cow chewing its cud. And he said, yeah, maybe a bison's kosher, according to Torah law. So he ordered the bison. And lo and behold, he was then thinking about it, and he really didn't know. So he called back the waiter and said to the waiter, you know something, I'm going to cancel that order. I'll have tuna fish. Okay, that's always a safe thing. Okay, for Jews. Okay, tuna fish is always safe. Okay, so I'll have a tuna fish sandwich. And the waiter then said to him, but sir, the thing is, I put the order in already for the bison burger. If you don't take it, I will have to personally pay for it. And so Rabbi Borowitz then said, you know something, as a Reformed Jew, there is a hierarchy of the mitzvot that I follow. And in my mind, I'm not really sure about this bison. I don't know whether it's really kosher or not, but you know something, I am sure of what is ethical and moral or not. That I'm positive of. And I cannot allow this waiter to pay for something that I'm so confused about, whether it's kosher or not, whatever, according to Torah law. So he said to the waiter, okay, do me a favor, bring me the bison and bring me the tuna fish sandwich, and I'll just deal with both. Okay, by the way, bison is kosher. Okay, so anyway, the point of this is what? Is that Rabbi Borowitz then, as a modern Reformed Jew and heteronomically, was able to go through a process of what? Understanding that mitzvot are important, but also I, as a modern person, have the right to determine which mitzvot either make sense to me or are important to me and which ones aren't. Now, let me give an example from my own personal life, okay? And I'm going to be ending this in about 5 or so minutes from now, and then open up the microphones. I will unmute you all in case anyone wants to discuss any of this that I'm sharing with you. My own journey of kashrut. We'll leave Rabbi Borowitz aside for a moment. I was brought up, as most of you know, as very much of a classical Reformed Jew. We belonged to a temple, obviously. I was very much involved in temple and Jewish life from my earliest childhood years. However, in terms of the mitzvot and the mitzvot of Judaism, my family didn't follow many of them. Okay, I mean, my mother lit Shabbat candles, and that was the extent of our Shabbat worship. Sometimes we went to services on Friday night. I ended up going every Saturday by myself, okay? But one thing is for sure, going back to the subject of kashrut, let me put it this way. My father, Ira, he should rest in peace, he was well known in our community in Bell Harbor in Rockaway, Queens, as making the best lobster clam bakes of anyone in the area. He was noted for his lobster clam bakes, very well known for this. So no, we certainly did not keep kosher on any level in my family, that's for sure. But as I began studying these laws and traditions and also getting married, is Judy and I decided we were going to have a fully kosher home. And when we were living in Brooklyn during the first 7 years of our marriage, only bringing into our home kosher slaughtered meat as well. But as time has gone on, some of the aspects of keeping kosher have slipped aside. We certainly determined not to keep kosher outside of our house strictly. And the reason why, certainly when our parents were living, none of them kept kosher, so we would not be able to live with them. It created many different hardships. But to this very day, we still do have in our homes, and some of you know this, we do continue to stay kosher in our home, and we have 2 sets of dishes, milk and meat, obviously, fleischik. And the reason why is, I don't really know, and I don't hear God saying to me, keep kosher. But just like the mezuzah on the door in our home, which defines this house as being a Jewish home, when I have to make a decision as to what we're going to have for dinner, is that I have to make a Jewish decision. Do I go to the milkic side or do I go to the fleischik side? So I'm doing this based upon not Torah law, not rabbinic law, but rather simply the culture and customs of our people. So in my own life is that I'm able to take my autonomy, my freedom to be able to determine the way I'm going to live my Jewish life in regards to kashrut and other things as well. And then be able to say, you know something, I can make the decisions, but I always try to do it out of respect for what? The tradition. I do believe, and you know, I really get into a real problem. And lately, a lot of people have been asking me this, especially here in Florida. When I meet people I don't know, and they say to me, "Oh, you're a Reform rabbi?" And I said, "Well, I was ordained at a Reform seminary, Hebrew Union College in New York." And they say, "Oh, I guess you're a Reform Jew." And I said to this one person, "I'm not sure what kind of Jew I am anymore. Maybe I'll call myself a trans Jew." And I said, "No, that's not going to work. That doesn't work. Okay, that's going to take me to someplace else. Okay, so no, I'm not. I leave that aside. But but basically, I'm gonna, and Rick, I'm gonna ask you to go back to that in a moment. Okay, which you just wrote on the chat. Thank you. Is that I'm not concerned about being branded Reform, conservative, Orthodox, traditional, untraditional, whatever. But rather, I think that there are only two kinds of Jews in this world. And I actually think there are only two kinds of human beings in this world. There are people who are serious, and there are people who are not serious. That's what, to me, it's all about. I know people who are Reformed in the background, belong to the Reformed synagogues that are represented here on the Zoom tonight, and whatnot, and part of my life and a part of the Reform world, who are as serious as the most serious Satma or Chabad, even Rebbe that I've ever met. And on the opposite, I know people who daven every day, and they have payas down to here, and they have tzitzis down to here, and they are not serious because they're just doing the stuff, but with nothing behind it. And that's what I'm going to be talking about the next class, about what's behind it all. Because that really is, to me, the full Jew is when you do mitzvot to the best of your ability and to those that make sense to you, but you do it with a spiritual underpinning that girds it with what? In God. Okay, but I'll talk about that next time. So to put this all together then, is that what then is, in a Reform context, a serious Jew? It is one who, as I've tried to describe it to the best of my ability tonight, and you can see I'm still kind of working through a lot of these thoughts, is a person who, number one, is respects the tradition, because the tradition is God-given. It is divine. It is, what do I mean by that? Whether it literally is the word of God speaking, or simply it is the generations of our people handing it down, giving it a sense of an imprimatur that is a stamp saying this is what Jews do as a people. A serious Jew looks at the traditions, studies the history of the customs, the laws, the mitzvot, whatever they are. And then, as an autonomous person and as a Reformed Jew, we can then say, well, you know something, this means something to me. This makes me feel better as a Jew. This makes me feel more fulfilled as a Jew. So I will do this today, and maybe tomorrow, maybe not, and maybe other things as well. But never saying, simply discarding anything as our Reformed Jews did a century or two ago, simply because I didn't understand it. The question is, do we feel it? And to make that a part of our Jewish life. And then that's the kind of Jew that I think a Reformed Jew truly is, one who is serious and appreciates things, but ultimately makes those decisions for oneself as to how one lives a Jewish life. And so that's what I want to share with all of you tonight. And I hope that this makes some sense to you. This is a respect for the traditions and to revere them, but to understand how really Judaism does and God asks of us to make this meaningful to us. and simply, as Reform Jews did, to simply discard all these traditions and customs and mitzvot, simply because they're too, you can't make sense of them, doesn't make any sense at all. We do things because we should, if they make sense to us as Jews, but each one of us should do this individually. So, Jeanette, if you can still hear me, could you unmute everybody?
Yeah, everyone has the ability to unmute themselves if they would like to speak.
So, Rick, would you do me a favor, since you did write something in the chat? What did you mean by your comment about a mikdash ma'at, okay?
Yeah, Merrill and I suffer all of the ebbs and flows and the pulls of tradition and modern world. Many years ago, we decided, it happened on the marriage encounter weekend, in which our rabbi at the time explained to us what he called the concept of Mikdash Ma'at, which means small sanctuary, which means that your home is your sanctuary, and it's a sanctuary from the rest of the world. So if you're going to do something in the world, you can, if your home is your sanctuary, you don't do that in your home. And even though you might succumb to it in the world, I'm not sure that I'm explaining it exactly right, but our daughters are, one of our daughters is Orthodox. My grandchildren are Orthodox. Our home has always been kosher from before they were born. And our house in Florida, where I am now, is also kosher so that my grandchildren can come here and they can eat here. But if I go out into the modern world, I will not always eat kosher. I will eat shellfish. I will eat, you know, I don't eat bacon. I don't eat pork. The one thing I don't eat anything having to do with pork. But our home, once you come into our doors, our home is kosher. That seems like an oxymoron. It seems like it doesn't make any sense at all, but it allows us to live and exist in a modern world where if you're hungry, the closest place is a Chick-fil-A or something. Well, we don't eat there anyway, but a McDonald's, you know, sandwich. How else would I exist in the modern world? But when I come to my house, I just came from the kosher butcher yesterday, and our house is purely, both houses, kosher. Outside the house, I live in the modern world. We're part of the modern world. It's not a Jewish world. It's not a Jewish culture in America, and so that's how we make it work. We in our house, we don't let everything in, you know, from the outside. I don't know if I explained it right.
Thanks. Does anyone else have anything to want to share or with us about all this, or comments about my presentation? Jane?
I guess my upbringing was maybe similar to Rick. I grew up in a strictly kosher home. My grandparents were all strictly kosher. My mother's home was strictly kosher. When I got married, our home was strictly kosher. My grandparents were Orthodox, very Orthodox, but all the siblings, all my mother's siblings, did not remain Shabbat, Shomer Shabbat. They lived in the modern world, used electricity, drove where we needed to drive. We went from Orthodox shuls growing up to conservative synagogue, where the thought was we were allowed to drive to synagogue and basically not do many other things, but we lived in the modern world. We did eat outside of the home. When we ate outside of our home, we did not eat strictly kosher. Sometimes we did. We ate, I guess you would call it, kosher style. We did not eat shellfish or ham or anything like that, but we ate kosher style. or we went to kosher delis, that kind of thing. When I came to Florida, oh, and I had 4 sets of dishes. By the way, you had 2 sets, Rick. We had 4 sets of dishes.
I had,
2 sets for all year and 2
That's
sets
all.
for Pesach.
we also had 6, we had 6 sets.
And I didn't have good dishes and bad dishes. I had fine china for everything, fine china for dairy, fine china for meat, and the same thing. When I came to Florida, that was my choice. What should I do? I knew the first year we were going to rent our condo to a stranger. I didn't want to put our kosher dishes here because I thought, I don't know if they're going to keep it. They'll mix everything up. They'll conflate everything. It won't be kosher anymore. So I put in 1 or 2 sets of dishes and 1 or 2 sets of silverware, and I didn't care what they did. When I came down, I took out my dishes. I did go to the kosher butcher in Delray. I started shopping there. And then it was not, now it is Glick's Kosher Butcher in Delray. It used to be Oriel Kosher Market years ago. I'm here 36 years, it's a long time. And it turned out I didn't really like Oriel Kosher Market. I didn't like his meat. I didn't think they did things well. I was used to prime kosher meat up north. When I served a kosher filet, a roast, they thought it was non-kosher. My butcher gave me a special cut of meat that he called top of the filet. He only gave it to 5 or 6 customers that would appreciate it. Everybody else he gave junk that they didn't care. So when I made a roast, everyone thought I was really serving filet mignon, but it was strictly kosher. And Oriel Market didn't have that kind of meat, and I didn't like the way they were serving things. I was standing online one day to buy something, and I looked at the help, and I looked at the market, and I put it back. And then I asked people where I live, where do you buy meat? I didn't want to buy meat in Publix. I couldn't do that. I was coming from a kosher life at home. And people told me of some private meat markets. And I started to go to 1 or 2 of them. And I was starting not to buy a lot of red meat anymore anyway, not too much red meat. So I got used to little by little not buying kosher meat. But my house is still kosher style.
Right.
I guess I would call it kosher style. I don't bring in ham or shellfish or anything like that.
And Jane, the process you're describing is very interesting, and Rick also, but it becomes more challenging when you, for instance, for someone like myself who was brought up the opposite with no kashrut at all, and to take on these aspects of Jewish life, thereby becomes a process of trying to understand them and to decide which ones are meaningful or not. Obviously, I'm going to move it away from kashrut for a little bit. Take, for instance, the whole idea of wearing a kippah. And Rick, looking at Rick, as he might remember, the first time he and I went to Israel together on one of the temple trips. And the minute we got on that El Al plane, we put a kippah on.
Right.
And we kept that kippah on until we got off that plane, whatever it was, 2 weeks later, right?
Yeah, 3 weeks, yeah.
And every time when I was in Israel a couple of weeks ago, the moment I got on that plane, I put it on. And obviously the opposite coming back. And the question becomes is, why did I feel so comfortable there and not, I don't want to do that here, or not, although whenever I go into the temple, I put the yarmulke on, or when I do so, or obviously when I say prayers, I put the yarmulke on, but I don't wear it all the time. We're in Israel for 2 weeks. Either this was on or my bicycle helmet was on. So these are different aspects of Jewish life. The thing is what I'm suggesting tonight is we need to struggle with them, because if they were so important for Jews over these centuries, then it should be important for us to at least not simply put them aside, and we should struggle with them and say, what might they mean to us, any of these things? Take, for instance, making a prayer life. And I've talked to some of you about this. You've heard me speak about this. Some of you get up in the morning and you might say a prayer. Maybe you say the Shema. Maybe you say the Shema when you go to sleep. But how many of you have ever actually begun a prayer life of actually taking a siddur, a Jewish prayer book? When you get up in the morning, actually do the Shema and say the V'ahavta prayer, or maybe more prayers. And to say to yourself, Well, this is important. And why is it important? Why has it been important to Jews over these centuries? Some of you might remember the story that I told, and that is at the when I was a chaplain at Sloan Kettering. I never built a sukkah at my home, but there was always obviously a sukkah at our synagogue and places like that. So, and certainly when I grew up, again, obviously in the kind of family that I grew up with, we definitely didn't have a sukkah, that's for sure. Was not even a twinkle in my parents' eyes. Well, I'll never forget visiting this Hasidic gentleman at Sloan Kettering, and it was Sukkot. And I walked into his room, and you could see the lulav and etrog in the room. And he looked up at me and he said to me, "Rabbi, where is the sukkah here at the hospital? I have to daven lulav and etrog." And I thought for a moment, and I knew there wasn't one. So I said to him, "Well, I'm sorry, we don't have one here." And he rolled up his sleeve and he showed me his numbers tattooed there from Auschwitz. And how, you want to know how low I felt at this moment? He said to me, "You see these numbers here from Auschwitz? Rabbi, in Auschwitz, we had a sukkah." And you're telling me here in New York, that has the largest Jewish population in the entire world, that there is no sukkah? Well, I want to die. I mean, I want to just die. To him, it was important. To me, it was a thing that Jews do. The synagogue does it. But personally, to me, it was never one of the main things in my Jewish life. Well, I made sure that I said to him, "Well, I'm sorry, we don't have one, but I'll do the best I can to ensure for the future there is." And by the next year, the sukkah was built on the roof. And to my knowledge, there's still a sukkah to this very day, whatever it is, 40 years later or something. But the point is this, is then guess what? I still didn't build a sukkah at home. But one thing is for sure, every single year, I made sure that I did buy or had bought through the synagogue a lulav and etrog so that I could daven the lulav and etrog, which I certainly didn't do when I was growing up in my ultra-reform background. So the thing is, these mitzvot can become important to us when we see them and struggle with them and ask ourselves, what do they mean for us? So my presentation tonight was really one to get you thinking, hopefully. And it doesn't matter how old you are, okay? As the expression is, it's never too late, okay? We can always take on more mitzvot, do more mitzvot, but to understand really the basis of a Jewish life is number one, is every single one of the sources, every one of the books says the first one is to believe in God. That's number one. But the other is, as that little video pointed out, is what do you do as a Jew in your Jewish life? That's the key. And which mitzvot are you willing to take on? Or as Franz Rosenzweig, another great Jewish theologian from the early 20th century, who said, "I might not do something today, but maybe tomorrow I'll do it." Okay. Whatever that mitzvah might be. And for some of you, it might be lighting Shabbat candles. It might be going to synagogue. It might be praying. It might be going to the mikvah. It might be doing something Jewish and trying it and struggling with it, but always to ask yourself after study, what did it mean to other Jews and what does it mean to us? Some of you might be familiar. If you're not, it's an extraordinary book called the Kuzari, Kuzari, by Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, Judah Halevi, written in the 1500s. And it's a very interesting book. The book is written obviously because they were Jews who were leaving Judaism, similar to today, or didn't find Judaism to be very consequential in their lives. And so he wrote this book for them. The book is about the king of the Khuzars. And by the way, the kingdom of the Khuzars actually existed. It is near Nepal. And this is an historical fact of what happened in part. The historical fact is the king of the Khuzars actually converted his kingdom to Judaism, which is very interesting. But in the Yehuda Halevi's book, This king is having a nightmare, a dream every night. In this dream, God approaches him and says to the king of the Khuzars, your heart is in the right place, but you're looking in the wrong place. You have to find the right religion for you and your people. So, of course, he calls upon first the major religions of the world at that time. So he calls into his chamber a Christian teacher, maybe a priest, Catholic priest, and asks him to teach him about Christianity, Catholicism. And after a chapter or two, he says, well, this doesn't mean anything to me, and says, thank you, goodbye. He then calls an imam in and asks for an explanation about Islam. And again, the same thing happens. He discards Islam's teachings. He calls a rabbi in, and the next 300 pages of the book about Judaism. Okay, obviously it's about a rabbi written by Yehuda Halevi. But the key to the book is the following. What distinguishes Judaism in a particular way from these other two religions? All three religions are revelatory. In other words, God spoke. Okay? In Christianity, God spoke to Jesus and then developed Christianity later on. In Islam, it's all about Muhammad. Okay? It's all about Muhammad. Where in Judaism, it's not about a single individual. And this is what Yehuda Halevi speaks specifically at. It's about the experience of a people, if you take the Torah literally, 600,000 of them at Mount Sinai. And therefore, it cannot be discarded, but seen as a revelatory religion of a way of life through the Torah and the mitzvot to a people, not an individual. Because you can always say, an individual mistook it. An individual was wrong. An individual really didn't hear the word of God. With an individual, this miracle or that miracle didn't really occur or occurred in a different way. But when a whole people experiences a miracle, a whole people hears the word of God, that's a valid experience. And that's where Judaism is so very, very powerful. Well, the point is this. Of all of this is, as Reformed Jews, unfortunately, quite often, Reformed Jews or also a lot of these born new age Jews really think it's all about me. It's all about my meditation. It's all about my spiritual being turned on. But again, to bring this back to my opening words, and then we'll call it a night. It's getting late. And that is, guess what? It's not all about me as a me, it's about me as a Jew. Because remember, the word Jew in Hebrew is Yehudi, one of the tribe of Judah, one of the people of Israel. And that's what we are. And the challenge that I give to all of you as modern Reformed Jews is to figure out what that means to you in a serious way. As a member of the tribe, but also as an individual before God, because each one of us stands before God as individuals. So the next class, I'm going to talk about the spiritual underpinnings of the mitzvot in terms of Kabbalah. So we're going to learn a little Kabbalah, a little about Jewish mysticism, and the power of these mitzvot, all of these actions, all of them. As some of you know, I wear tzitzis. I wear tzitzis underneath my garments all the time. I don't wear them showing, because guess what? It doesn't mean anything to me. I don't have to show them to anybody. They're important to me and God. So it's all about what? About forming a relationship with the divine and thereby bringing it back to ourselves, our family, and to our community and the people of Israel. That's what, to me, it's all about. And I hope you've enjoyed the presentation tonight. So everyone, shalom, peace, okay? If you have any questions or thoughts, comments, actually,